Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. Jacksonville, Florida, January 1993. A 23-year-old mother, Bonnie Haim, does not place a 911 call. By sunrise, two facts set the tone for the investigation. Her purse, with cash and identification, turns up in a hotel trash bin near the airport, and her car is located in long-term parking at Jacksonville International. Those two locations imply travel. The untouched cash and left-behind ID do not. Detectives classify the case as a suspicious disappearance, not a confirmed homicide. No indoor homicide scene is established at the family home. In plain terms, nothing in the residence meets the threshold for a primary crime scene in 1993. Procedurally, the early hours are about timestamps and access, who last saw or spoke to Bonnie, when her workplace expected her, which employees at the nearby hotel handled the trash route where the purse was found. Which lot attendant first flagged the car? It's 1993, limited surveillance coverage, inconsistent retention, and no smartphone exhaust to mine. Investigators document what they do have: location of recovery, chain of custody for the purse, inventory of its contents, tow and impound records for the vehicle, and a clean description of the car's placement in long-term parking. The entries are dry by design. That's how you keep a file from drifting. Victimology is recorded in neutral language. Bonnie is young, employed, and by several accounts, making arrangements to relocate with her child. That detail matters because it often creates digital, financial, or logistical footprints. Here, the contradiction stands. A person planning a move typically carries essential items, not discards them intact. The data align too cleanly. Sometimes that's the problem. Scene technicians do not force a narrative onto silence. Without a primary scene, there are no swabs to prioritize, no trajectory to model, no interior blood pattern to reconstruct. The car is processed as a potential proxy scene, not proof of departure. The purse is evidence of placement, not proof of presence. Investigators ask the question you should be asking: who benefits if we assume she left town? In a city like Jacksonville, a trail this tidy isn't comfort. It's a signal. What follows in the coming days is methodical. Canvassing around the hotel and airport corridors, re-interviews of relatives, co-workers, and neighbors, checks on bank and employment records, and a documented review of prior calls for service, if any. The tone stays clinical because precision is how you protect a case that may have to stand for decades. If labs can't speak yet, the logbook has to. For this series, you'll hear a clear line through every development. 1993 remains a disappearance with red flag staging indicators, not a proven indoor homicide. Years later, that changes, but not in a living room. It changes under concrete. Victimology anchors the file. At 23, Bonnie Haim held a steady job, managed a household, and according to multiple legitimate contacts, was in the process of arranging a move with her young child. Detectives didn't treat those statements as rumor. They looked for paper, dates, and money, lease inquiries, deposit receipts, utility transfer requests, child care arrangements. If a relocation was imminent, there should be a footprint you can point to, not a feeling you can't verify. Work records formed the first lane. Supervisors confirmed expected shift times around the first week of January 1993 and noted any missed clock-ins. Payroll stubs were copied. The point wasn't drama, it was sequence. A person preparing to move usually ties down employment details or signals a transition. Bonnie's file shows routine employment up to the disappearance, nothing consistent with a pre-planned midnight flight. That matters because the purse with cash and ID recovered near the airport reads differently if the owner was methodically planning a legitimate relocation. Leaving the essentials behind undermines that narrative. Detectives ran a second lane through housing and utilities. They contacted apartment complexes named by friends and family, checked for applications, deposits, or waitlist notes, and asked about any scheduled move-in dates. They checked power and phone companies for transfer requests. The responses yielded enough to support the premise that she was organizing a move, but nothing to support that she suddenly abandoned cash and identification to catch a flight. In cases like this, intent lives in documents. Intent does not normally look like abandoned money. Childcare and school contacts made up the third lane. Was there a conversation about a new drop-off routine? Any request for records release? These checks didn't produce a gap-closing revelation, but they clarified posture. Bonnie wasn't drifting. She was planning. Planning is linear. Staged departures try to simulate linearity without the boring paperwork, which is why investigators weigh receipts and applications more heavily than statements alone. The data align too cleanly at the airport. Sometimes that's the problem. Phone activity in 1993 is limited by the era. No smartphone metadata. Landline logs exist, but only within the constraints of the carrier and retention. Detectives pulled what they could: recent outgoing calls, any operator-assisted activity, and payphone angles around the hotel corridor where the purse appeared. Nothing in those captures negated the central contradiction. A person on the verge of moving keeps the means to do it. She doesn't discard them intact in a trash bin. In towns like Jacksonville, a trail that looks like travel but leaves the traveler without identification is not a mistake. It's a message. Neighbors and coworkers were re-interviewed with structure. Who heard direct statements about leaving? Who saw boxes or changes in routine? Were there requests for help with a truck? Those interviews built a consistent picture of short-term planning without any last-minute travel itinerary. For the file, that consistency is valuable. It doesn't prove a crime. It narrows legitimate explanations for the staging at the airport. When intent and conduct diverge this sharply, seasoned investigators move the weight of the case toward the people who benefit from the divergence. Financial checks followed. ATM usage, bank balance stability, recent withdrawals, and whether any cards were used after the purse was found. Investigators documented the status of the funds and whether any activity occurred post-disappearance. The reporting aligns with a basic rule of suspicious disappearances. No credible post-event financial trail increases the probability that the person did not voluntarily relocate. It also strengthens the inference that the airport tableau was built for audience effect, to make observers accept a story the records don't support. Throughout this chapter, note what is and isn't being said. There is no indoor homicide scene established in 1993. There is no claim here that a specific person carried out a homicide. There is, however, a growing evidentiary divide, verifiable planning to move on one side, abandoned essentials and a parked car on the other. That divide is where cases either fray or hold. This one held because the file stayed disciplined: logs, receipts, precise language, and an open admission that labs couldn't speak yet. When labs have nothing to test, documentation becomes the spine. If victimology feels clinical, that's by design. It is the cleanest way to respect a person's life in a criminal investigation, by getting the facts right and forcing every inference to earn its place. The value for viewers and families is simple. When intent is captured on paper and contradicted by staging, the investigation doesn't have to guess. It has to prove. The case file moves forward when the timeline hardens. In early January 1993, two recoveries near Jacksonville International Airport shape that line. First, a hotel employee reports a purse found in a trash receptacle behind the property. Inside, cash and identification belonging to Bonnie Haim, age 23. Second, a vehicle registered to her is located in long-term parking at the airport. Travel cues are present. Traveler behaviors are not. Investigators convert those scenes into timestamps, names, and chain of custody entries. That is how you turn a mystery into a schedule. The hotel recovery is documented with a simple sequence: who discovered the purse, when the manager contacted authorities, which officer first handled it, and when it was sealed and logged. The inventory lists the cash and ID, recorded as intact. That matters because theft is the simplest explanation for missing property and the fastest way to eliminate the airport from serious consideration. Here, theft is not supported. The purse becomes less like a lost item and more like a placed object. I've stood on back lots like that. Lighting, traffic noise, delivery hours. If you meant to hide something forever, you wouldn't pick a bin that gets emptied daily. If you meant to signal something, you might. The long-term parking recovery is handled differently. Officers request lot records, entry stubs or logs consistent with 1993 practices, and note the stall location and the vehicle's condition on first contact. Keys, doors, windows, ignition. Each detail is captured once, so it doesn't have to be argued later. The tow to impound is time-stamped, and a separate log covers the intake inspection. In a perfect world, you'd have cameras covering ingress and egress. In 1993, you often don't. What you do have is position. Long-term parking usually serves travelers expecting to be gone more than a day. Placing a car there suggests a trip. Leaving cash and ID somewhere else argues against it. The contradiction is the point. Detectives then attempt to align the two finds. Which came first, the purse in the hotel trash or the car parked in long-term? If the hotel recovery precedes the lot discovery, did publicity about the purse cause a cross-check of plates that revealed the car, or was the car independently found by staff doing routine patrols? What triggered which is not trivia. It reveals whether someone counted on a predictable chain reaction from responders. A staged sequence benefits from assumptions. Real travel itineraries generate independent footprints, ticketing, calls, baggage. Here, the record shows the appearance of travel, not the durable traces of it. Processing the car as a proxy scene is clinical and restrained. The vehicle can hold transfer evidence, but the presence of fibers or hair in a family car tells you little unless context warrants it. What matters more at this stage is the absence of normal traveler prep, boarding passes or travel paperwork consistent with January 1993, handwritten lists for a trip, any suitcase evidence. The file's description doesn't elevate routine items into revelations. It notes what is and isn't there. When a vehicle parked for a trip does not present signs of a trip, investigators log the disconnect, add it to the wait pile. Back at the hotel, officers canvass housekeeping, maintenance, and night shift. Who took out the trash and at what time? Was the bin recently emptied? Did anyone recall a person approaching from the lot rather than the lobby? The questions are practical, not dramatic. If the purse was deposited in the early morning, lighting conditions limit observation. If the deposit occurred earlier, more staff were moving around. Even without video, consistent staff routines can narrow the window. That window, combined with the long-term parking entry estimate, starts to form a bracket around when the staging could have occurred. Financial checks run parallel to the scene work. Investigators verify whether the cash in the purse matches recent withdrawals and whether any cards were used after the purse was found. If a traveler dumped a purse and still traveled, you might see emergency activity, airline counters, wired funds, calls to friends. The record does not support that scenario. There is no credible post-disappearance financial trail that reads like a last-minute airport pivot. For detectives, that silence is not just concerning, it's directional. It points away from voluntary flight. It's easy to overread a car in an airport lot. People borrow vehicles, park for others, forget stubs. That's why the timeline is built from converging lanes: hotel recovery, lot placement, call-in times, dispatch logs, impound entries. When those lanes point to a single morning window and a single corridor around the airport, the probability of a staged departure increases. The language in the file stays careful. Staged indicators present, not staged beyond doubt. Precision now prevents overreach later. This is the point in the story where many cases lose clarity because the evidence feels almost too neat. A purse with money and ID left where a worker will find it. A car exactly where a traveler might leave one. But experience in violent crime units says neatness is a tell. Natural life is messy. Rushed packing, odd receipts, a call to a friend about a ride. Staging often looks better than life because it's designed after the fact. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. One more note about tone because it matters. Describing a staged tableau does not require vilifying anyone. The most respectful approach to a victim is accuracy. A careful timeline guards against rumor and sustains a case across years. In January 1993, labs can't do much with a hotel bin and a parked car, but records can. And records, if kept straight, can carry a case through long gaps until something new breaks the silence. When a case stalls for lack of a primary scene, investigators turn to the few things that still move: witness statements, routine checks, and any words a child may have said. Handling those words is never casual. In the United States, child statements are gathered under strict forensic interview protocols: quiet rooms, neutral prompts, no leading questions, and full recording when possible. The point is to reduce suggestion and capture what the child can reliably report in age-appropriate language. It's clinical by design because an imprecise method can permanently compromise a case. In the months after Bonnie Haim disappeared in early January 1993, the file records indicate that a very young child made remarks adults could not ignore. Age matters here. A 3-year-old processes time and cause differently than an older child. That is why investigators involve specialized interviewers, professionals trained to build rapport, ask open-ended questions, and avoid cueing. Before any interview, authorities standardize collateral information: who first heard the remarks, the exact words as originally reported, and whether multiple adults may have repeated or paraphrased them. If statements were repeated in different settings, that repetition is logged too. Consistency across retellings can be as important as the initial content. A proper forensic interview with a child this young moves slowly and documents everything: the child's ability to identify people, the difference between truth and make-believe, and the sequence of what happened next in the child's own words. The interviewer does not feed vocabulary. Children are invited to describe, draw, or point. If a child uses a particular phrase, the interviewer asks what that phrase means to the child. This matters later when courts evaluate whether the statement is spontaneous, whether it carries sufficient guarantees of trustworthiness, and whether it may be admitted for the jury to hear. It's important to say what this interview is not. It is not an interrogation. It is not a search for a confession through a child. It is one more lane of information to be tested against hard facts, timestamps, documents, later forensic results. And in a disappearance where laboratories have no primary scene to process, even a small, consistent phrase can shape where detectives look next. In this case, the child's statements entered the record within carefully defined limits. The notes reflect that adults initially struggled with what to do. What you do not want is a chorus of well-meaning caretakers prompting the same phrasing over and over. That is how contamination happens. The team's role is to freeze the situation, document verbatim phrasing as originally reported, then let a trained interviewer take it from there. Interviews are scheduled, counsel is briefed, the questions are scripted to avoid suggestion. The result is not a solution. It is an evidentiary unit with known strengths and known weaknesses, ready to be weighed. For a viewer used to dramatic reveals, this can feel frustrating. The file in 1993 stays careful. A child said X, the interviewer documented X, and X is preserved without embellishment. Where many cases fail is not the child's reliability. It is the adult's handling. If you push, you shape answers. If you lead, you teach words. If you don't record, you lose the context that makes a phrase meaningful. Here, discipline keeps the case from collapsing under later scrutiny. Legally, child statements can reach a jury under specific hearsay exceptions or statutory frameworks that recognize the vulnerability of very young witnesses. Courts ask whether the child had a motive to fabricate, whether the statement was spontaneous, whether there was consistency across time, and whether there is corroboration. Corroboration does not need to be dramatic. It can be as simple as alignment with known timelines or later found physical evidence. Without a primary scene in 1993, corroboration could only come from two places: detailed adult documentation in the present and evidence discovered in the future. That is one reason these interviews matter. Even when they feel like fragments, they can hold a place in the file for years until something material lines up behind them. There is another discipline point worth noting. Detectives avoid showing a child items linked to the case. They avoid yes/no questions that invite agreement. They avoid time anchors the child cannot understand. Instead, they look for sensory details a child would naturally report and for descriptions that would be hard to coach. Even small elements, a location name the child would not otherwise know, a gesture consistent with a particular action, can be significant when later events produce physical proof. None of this stands alone. It is weight on the scale, not the scale itself. As the interview materials settle into the Bonnie Haim file, the broader investigation does what disciplined investigations do. It resists pressure to substitute narrative for evidence. Detectives do not claim a homicide scene inside the home in 1993. They do not pretend a forensics lab can answer questions it cannot. Instead, they keep clean notes, preserve the child's phrasing, and wait to see whether later developments, if any, will give those words a place to land. That approach respects the child and it respects the court. It also respects the viewers who want a truthful account, not a dramatized version of what someone hopes is true. There is a human dimension here that belongs in any honest recounting. Families confronting a disappearance are asked to sit inside uncertainty, while strangers with badges ask difficult, precise questions. Those questions are a form of care, not suspicion. They preserve options. When a community hears that a child spoke, the instinct is to assign certainty. The correct move is to assign procedure. These are not competing virtues. They are the only way to keep a case from cracking under its own weight. For this story, these fragments do not end the mystery. They keep it on track. The child's words will appear again years later, legally, within boundaries, when other evidence exists to test them against. Until then, they remain what they were in 1993, a small light in a dark file, documented with care so it can be seen clearly when the time comes. Cold cases don't freeze, they cool to a controlled temperature. After January 1993, the Jacksonville file on Bonnie Haim stayed open to periodic action, scheduled recontacts with relatives and coworkers, checks for identity use, DMV and Social Security activity reviews, and a standing request to flag any remains located in the region that matched her age, sex, and stature. Detectives logged each pass. When laboratories had nothing new to test, documentation did the heavy lifting. Supervisors assigned maintenance tasks that don't make headlines but matter in court. Evidence custody was audited so the person vehicle records already logged would be admissible years later. Interview notes were retyped for legibility. Addenda clarified who said what and when. If a prior witness used approximate dates, an investigator sought corroboration from payroll sheets or school calendars. The doctrine was simple. A case that may be tried decades later must read as if it could be tried tomorrow. There was outreach, too. Tips cycle in on anniversaries and after reruns of similar cases. Each was routed through a standard form: source, claim, specificity, and whether it introduced a new person, event, or location not already explored. Most tips did not survive that screen. The few that did were tested against the only durable anchors available: timestamps from the airport corridor and the documented plan that Bonnie had to relocate with her child. Nothing credible moved those anchors. The file remained a suspicious disappearance with staged indicators and no primary scene. Technology improved while the case waited. By the late 1990s and into the 2000s, agencies had better database access and more consistent digital retention. Detectives reran the basics more than once: identity checks, financial activity, immigration queries, and jail intake name matches. They weren't looking for drama. They were looking for legitimate life signs that would argue against harm. There were none. That absence doesn't prove a homicide in 1993, but it narrows alternatives a jury would need to consider later. Another lane lived outside criminal procedure: civil court. In subsequent years, Bonnie's family pursued civil action. The details of those proceedings belong to their case files, but the practical outcome matters for this investigation. Property tied to the family home changed hands. Over time, the former family residence would not remain a sealed landmark of the past. It would be accessible to the person who grew up there. That's not foreshadowing for effect. It's the bridge between a dormant file and the first material break the case ever gets. The investigative mindset during these years is worth stating plainly. The team did not inflate fragments into conclusions. They did not retroactively declare a homicide scene in the house. They did not claim forensic proof that didn't exist. They kept the chain of custody clean, the interviews separate from opinion, and the notes capable of surviving cross-examination. In towns like Jacksonville, that discipline is how you respect victims and hold a case together long enough for the truth to surface. There are human stakes behind that discipline. Families live with uncertainty. Investigators live with incomplete pathways. It is tempting to reach for closure through speculation. The best detectives refuse that impulse. They aim for clarity over catharsis, because clarity can carry a case the last mile when a physical scene finally appears. And in this story, the scene that matters won't be found in a bedroom or a hallway. It will be found outdoors years later, when someone with a lawful right to make changes on private property decides to do exactly that. By the early 2010s, the file looked the way a strong cold case should: lean, readable, and ready if anything new came in. The last pages before the break are not dramatic. They are procedural. An entry about property access, a note about planned work at a residence long tied to the history of this case, and a reminder that if anything of evidentiary value is discovered, the area must be secured, notifications made, and an excavation run by the book. I've seen cases fall apart because the years were unkind to the paperwork, not the evidence. This one endured the years. The lab still had nothing new. But the next development wouldn't come from a lab. It would come from the ground. In 2014, the first real break arrives where no one wanted it to, on private property tied to the family's past. Renovation work in the backyard exposes human remains in a shallow burial. Patrol locks down the address, logs entry times, and calls in crime scene, medical examiner, and evidence techs. A perimeter goes up. Photography captures the site before disturbance. Grid mapping fixes each item's location relative to fixed points on the property. This is the moment the case stops being only a disappearance. For the first time, investigators have a homicide-related scene. Excavation proceeds in controlled layers. Soil is screened, bone fragments are recovered and flagged. Any non-biological item is bagged separately. A .22 caliber casing is located in proximity to the remains and documented in situ, then collected, sealed, and labeled with date, time, GPS diagram coordinates, and initials of the collector. Chain of custody begins on the lawn and will follow every item to the lab. Nothing leaves without a signature. At the medical examiner's office, bone and dental assessments are performed. Samples are prepared for DNA comparison against known familial references. When the result returns, it is direct and devastating. The remains are identified as Bonnie Haim. The file, which for 2 decades survived on disciplined paperwork and stage departure indicators, now has what it never had: physical proof that the missing person did not relocate and did not reappear under another identity. The legal posture changes. The case moves from suspicious disappearance to homicide with remains. Back at the property, evidence techs continue scene work. Secondary metal detection sweeps, deeper screening along the slab edge, and drainage checks for any micro items that could have migrated. Measurements confirm the grave's depth and footprint. Analysts note soil compaction patterns that distinguish original ground from backfill. The diagram set is complete enough that a jury could understand the layout without ever visiting the yard. That is deliberate. Scenes fade, records must not. From an investigative standpoint, 3 facts now anchor everything that follows. First, the location: a burial in the backyard of the former family home, not in a public field or an unknown lot. Second, the identity: laboratory confirmation that the remains are Bonnie. Third, the adjacent physical clue: the .22 casing documented near the burial. None of these items alone answers who, how, or when with courtroom precision, but together they redirect the case into a tight corridor of questions that can be charged and tried. There is a human reality to this turn that deserves one steady sentence. The discovery is made lawfully, through normal life, property use, permitted work, and a decision to change a space no one expected to still hold evidence. In towns like Jacksonville, that's how old cases move, not by a cinematic confession, but by a shovel, a diagram, and a lab match that finally speaks for someone who could not. The day the lab report named the remains, the case moved from holding pattern to action. Detectives drafted affidavits built on the new anchors: a shallow backyard burial at the former family home, DNA confirmation of Bonnie Haim, and a .22 caliber casing documented near the grave. Prosecutors reviewed the file, tightened language around timeframes, and weighed this physical proof against the earlier airport findings and the preserved child statements. When probable cause was complete, an arrest warrant issued. In 2015, the suspect was taken into custody out of state and returned to Duval County, Florida. Transport logs and intake notes were kept as cleanly as any exhibit. What makes a cold case chargeable after 2 decades isn't a single revelation. It's the way multiple strands fit without forcing. The airport corridor had always suggested a story that didn't match ordinary travel. The documentation from 1993, purse with cash and ID in a hotel trash area, car left in long-term parking, never proved a homicide, but it created a pattern prosecutors could now set beside the burial site. The location of the grave shortened the list of people with opportunity. The DNA ended speculation about voluntary flight. The 22 casing added context investigators could argue at trial, not as a standalone answer, but as one more piece that agreed with the others. Processing in 2015 prioritized courtroom integrity. Detectives re-interviewed key witnesses to lock down what was memory and what was speculation. Statements from the 1990s were reviewed for consistency. Where a date in an old note was approximate, corroboration was sought in payroll or utility records. The recorded child statements from 1993 stayed within their legal box, limited, vetted, and never treated as the sole proof of anything. The point was weight, not volume. A jury hears mosaics more clearly when each tile is labeled once and placed precisely. Charging decisions reflected that philosophy. The state filed second-degree murder, a theory consistent with the evidence available, rather than a promise of facts the file could not support. Discovery packets went out. Defense counsel examined the chain of custody from the yard to the lab and the handling of the 22 casing. Prosecutors prepared demonstratives to explain why the airport tableau mattered, not because it was dramatic, but because it was tidy in a way authentic travel rarely is. In towns like Jacksonville, that kind of tidy is a tell. Through all of this, the family dimension remained present but formal. Victim advocates facilitated updates. Investigators avoided rhetorical flourishes in meetings and on paper. Trials are won when the paperwork is unremarkable, the logic is linear, and the science does the talking where it can. Here, the science said Bonnie did not leave. The scene said she was buried in a yard tied to her life. The earlier staging said someone needed people to believe otherwise. Together, those points formed a line a jury could follow. The file that survived on careful maintenance now had edges sharp enough to charge and try. The data no longer aligned too cleanly by accident. It aligned because the fragments finally had a place to lock. Courtrooms are built for clarity, not mystery. In Jacksonville, the state brought a second-degree murder charge built on what had finally become provable. A backyard burial at the former family home documented in 2014, DNA identification confirming the remains as Bonnie Haim, a .22 caliber casing recovered near the grave, and earlier staged departure indicators from 1993, the purse with cash and ID placed in a hotel trash area and the car left in long-term parking. Limited child statements preserved under forensic interview standards were admitted within legal boundaries to provide context rather than serve as the sole proof of anything. The theory was cumulative by design. No single exhibit had to carry the weight alone. Jurors heard a sequence, not a story. Technicians explained how the yard was secured, mapped, and excavated. The medical examiner walked through the identification process. Investigators outlined why airport travel queues without the normal travel footprint pointed to staging. The prosecution's closing didn't chase drama. It aligned facts. The location of the burial narrowed opportunity. The laboratory match ended speculation about voluntary flight, and the proximity of the casing supported the state's narrative without pretending it was a complete ballistics chain. Defense counsel did what the system expects, challenged admissibility and weight. They pressed the meaning of a single casing, questioned memory drift over time, and scrutinized the handling of historical statements. That scrutiny mattered. It forced the state to keep to what could be proven and to explain the limits of older evidence with precision. Trials are a test of process as much as facts. This one held because the paperwork held. In April 2019, the jury returned a guilty verdict on second-degree murder. On May 21, 2019, the court imposed life in prison. The case did not end in a flourish, it ended in a finding. For families who live inside long uncertainty, a verdict is not restoration, it is recognition. The record now said what was once only suspected. Bonnie did not leave, she was killed, and she was buried in a yard tied to her life. Appeals exist to correct error, not to retry facts. On April 30, 2021, Florida's First District Court of Appeal affirmed the conviction and the sentence. The panel addressed how key statements were handled, how the backyard scene was documented, and whether the jury received evidence within proper limits. The answer was yes. Post-conviction efforts that followed did not change the outcome. As of September 20th, 2025, the status remains the same. Life sentence affirmed. There is a narrow human point worth leaving in place. Cases like this survive because people do ordinary things with uncommon care. An officer who logs a time correctly in 1993, a technician who diagrams a lawn in 2014, a clerk who preserves a chain of custody line that no one will see for years. In towns like Jacksonville, that discipline is how the quiet finally speaks. It is not spectacle. It is work. If you followed from the missing person classification to the excavation to the verdict, you've seen why restraint matters. The investigation did not invent an indoor scene in 1993. It did not promise evidence that didn't exist. It preserved what it had until the day the ground yielded what it didn't. That is the lesson worth keeping. Documentation and patience are not delays. They are the route to truth when truth arrives late. I've walked you from a missing person file to a verdict because facts, logged, tested, and patient, still win in America. For me, the lesson is simple. Document everything, check on your neighbors, and take signs of control or fear seriously. Justice isn't fast, it's built. If this story moved you, tell me what detail hit hardest, or what you'd do differently in your own community. Drop a comment with where you're watching from or why this didn't work for you. And if you want more cases told straight, with respect and clarity, hit subscribe and stay with us for the next investigation.